the church wasn't always called 3Crosses. It was called Neighborhood Church.
They started as such a small group of people in a storefront in Oakland. There were just a handful of very devoted Christians there. A big answer to prayer was how the congregation grew because they wanted to reach more people.
8 years into the Great Depression, Reverend Earl Sexauer, born and raised in Ohio, just 23 years old, came to pastor a small congregation at a storefront church here in Oakland. Earl was convinced that God wanted him to build a place that would reach people who would not attend church.
Well, my first introduction to the neighborhood church was about 1939. It was at 6119 Trenner Avenue then, and it's now MacArthur. My dad found this house, which was just a few blocks from the church. I could remember it was $4,500. Cars were like $700 for a new Plymouth. Gasoline was about 14 cents a gallon.
Pastor Earl Sexauer, what I remember most is just that twinkle in his eye, you know. He loved life, and he really loved the Lord. He really cared for his congregation. It wasn't like just a job, it was like his life. He had big ideas. There was the sanctuary, a cross up in front. On either side there was the baptismal, and on the other side was the radio ministry. The radio ministry was carried on every Sunday on KLS. It was like a complete little mini service that you could go to in your own home. Oh, I'm sure it was Earl's idea to have that. Pastor Earl, he was right from the Bible, definitely a salvation preacher, especially Sunday nights.
All the time they had night services, and they were illustrated. Earl Sexauer started that. They were scenes from the Bible that they would create, and they were quite dramatic, so it drew a lot of people.
They were simple. There was no curtain to draw, and it was just done by the volunteers of the church.
I remember when Earl was dressed up like Moses and had a big catch basin in the bottom. When he hit the rock, the water just gushed out and everybody was in awe at this miracle that could happen right where the church pulpit was.
Earl's whole thought was the more that you can do to encourage people to come, the more souls can be saved. Dad and I always went to those. When I was 11 years old, that is when Earl's message really got to me, and I went home that night, knelt down by my bed, and gave my heart to Jesus. That tragedy in the Doyle family, the church just really took off with the membership and love and so forth.
My mother would go to church, but my dad wouldn't. But he'd meet me after Sunday school. I'd find him outside in the car reading the paper, and he'd take me home, you know. I shouldn't get emotional after all these years, but I do. My brother put this trash in the burning area. He threw gasoline on it, and it kind of exploded on him. He died of poisoning after about 3 months of torment, because I'd go in the hospital and you could hear him as he got closer to his ward, kind of just whimpering off and on, you know. It certainly had an effect on the church because it was small. So when that tragedy happened, they all surrounded my parents with all kind of things, bringing food over, praying with us, friendship, you know. My dad took another look at life. And in those days, the invitation was to come forward and kneel at the altar. And I remember my dad went forward, and I went with him. And together we accepted the Lord, and we were baptized in that little church. We had that sadness, but that brought us closer to the Lord as a family and as a church.
If you're going to understand the history of our church, you have to understand the port of call.
Well, the port of call had an interesting start. I remember the name of the lady who started. Her name was Muzzy. She was a redheaded lady and had lots of vim, vigor, and vitality.
Muzzy Bennett, she was a fun-loving lady. You just couldn't help but love her.
She came from another church, where I guess they were limiting what she could do. And so she got together every 6 hour and they built the port of call.
It was right next door in a little white building. It was small, but they made do with what they had.
During the war, there was a lot of Navy in the Bay Area because of the Treasure Island and the Navy bases. So
people would go down on the streets of Oakland where there were sailors just kind of roaming around. They would be invited to come out to the port of call and have a party. The hostesses, they would be in their later teens, early 20s. They would be there for the sailors when they came, and just to have a fun, clean, wholesome time at the port. She ran a tight ship, though. There was no, I would like to say, hanky-panky going on when Muzzy was around. They were able to spend the night. They would be given food, and a lot of that was just supplied by the congregation that wanted to help, and it kept them off the streets of downtown Oakland and off out of the bars and what have you. Muzzy, her soul was just a mom's soul, a mom away from home for those sailors. Earl and Muzzy, they just wanted to make a difference in the lives of these young men and the congregation. At that time, we had grown so much that the congregation had left the small church because we moved to the Foothill Women's Club.
the things that made it grow, you'd think there would be something outstanding, but it was just the Holy Spirit working His way in our hearts of the people.
And we had church in that women's club for, well, as long as it took to build the new church.
Neighborhood church has been obedient, faithful in their giving, faithful in their service work, and stuck strictly to the Word.
It was the people that just made the church. It's just a building without the souls in it.
The core of the leadership values of the pastors is the same Word, same truths, same gospel.
As the church grew, Earl's vision grew. Buildings that were bigger, a location that was better, because it was going to be a place of the future. The new building was Earl Sexauer's vision.
The building was huge.
It had a bigger and better portico, a double hydraulic stage for illustrated sermons.
I'd never seen a stage that went up and down before.
For Earl Sexauer, it was the cathedral of tomorrow.
One of these days I'm going home. One of these days.
I can remember going to church and being aware of a somber thing had happened.
When Earl was 40, he passed away very suddenly.
It was a heart attack that just took him right then.
A shock to everyone. It was just an overwhelming sadness.
He was dearly loved.
You think, well, what are we going to do now?
We all became closer knit, as tragedies often bring people together.
We knew where he was. We didn't know why the Lord had taken him, but we knew that there was a purpose, so we traveled on. The Lord was going to bring someone else.
I am one of the sons of Jake and Charlotte Veelig. My father was called to come and be the senior pastor.
He was a very formal leader. He could have been the head of a large corporation.
He actually told the board, if you want me to come, I'd love to preach and teach the word, but I am not an illustrated sermon guy.
Nobody had the energy of Jake Veelig. He was never somebody just to sit around on his hands and say, well, we've done it like this before. He would come up with something new.
His mission was share the love of God, whether it's across the ocean or across the street.
He came in June of '54. In December, the board said, I know the illustrated sermon stuff is not your thing, but we always do this Christmas play. And my dad said, yeah, okay, we'll do that. He came to realize the impact that has on people. And from that point on, it was like, hey, I'm going for this.
Sunday evening was really what really set us apart.
All these people would be flocking to the service. We had to take all the chairs that we would use up in the educational unit, and we all lugged those chairs into the service and put them in the aisles to accommodate everybody. There was even a lady in an iron lung that they rolled up the steps. It was the place to be.
The program would start, with the dimming of the lights. There'd be some singing, and then we'd go into the illustrated sermon.
I worked backstage. The curtain we rolled up by hand, and then it would catch.
And the curtains would part, and you'd have a vignette of some old ancient biblical king. It was so tactile, so visual.
The church was designed with a hydraulic stage. They would raise this stage, and there would be a full set of props on the lower stage, and it could be a living room, it could be a biblical scene, it could be anything.
Pastor Jake, he's preaching a service, but he might stop, and one of the characters furthered the plot along.
And so that did indeed make you listen to Jake. You were always kind of on your toes.
I remember as a kid, we would go down to quarter-pound burgers, and he would thumb through the jukebox playlist, and he would read the song titles and go, oh, that's a great one. We'll use that for the next sermon title. And it was that and a burger.
They did one of love and marriage, because there was a song that was love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage.
Shortening bread, 16 tons. The only purpose at the end was to introduce people to Christ.
I can remember one where it's always bad, it's the negative that will stick out. Ed Harris portrayed the devil, pitchfork and horns and all. And the fire that they had on the stage became a real fire.
There was one scene where a guy was supposed to take the robe off of Jesus. He pulled his wig off. And so everybody started laughing. And the guy that was playing Jesus, he had a hot mic, and he said some stuff he shouldn't have said, and everybody heard it. And so that was like, oh, what a disaster that was.
Last midnight service, Christmas Eve, the sheep escape.
Shepherds in full garb.
Chasing the sheep down MacArthur Boulevard.
Boy, if anybody had a little too much to drink, they might not have been too sure what they saw.
We had the choir until after Jake came, and then it changed. And we had the chorallaires.
The lights would go down, and then they would introduce a little something, and then you'd hear the chorallaires.
Well, the Chorallaires was a musical group that consisted of about 25 to 30 vocalists, and then an orchestra of maybe about 20.
Saxophones and clarinets and violins. And it was like, wow.
The Chorallaires were really fun to listen to. They were so good.
People loved it, and it was crowded every night. You came early so you'd have a place to sit.
It was the hottest thing in town.
The traditional church we'd come from, that was a very quiet, sedate type of music, and boy, this was peppy, and we loved it. It was almost like a Broadway show.
I think we took a lot of support but a lot of criticism in the Bay Area because we were just too far out there. It was too nightclub-ish for a lot of people. And yet if you go back and you look at the music, right on the money. I mean, it was really good, solid scriptural stuff.
One of the things that Jake Bealey emphasized was you had to have a lot of creative ways of drawing people to the church. For example, the bus ministry.
We started a little bus tour over in the projects and picked up all the kids that wanted to go to church.
We had buses that would go from Oakland all the way to Hayward and pick up kids.
You want to get people to come, go get them.
I'm a product of the bus ministry, and I grew up in a non-Christian family. I came to the church when I was about 8 years old. We didn't have a car at all, so there was no way to even get to church. And from the first Sunday I went, I absolutely loved it. I saw the difference in the people. These were people that showed a lot of love. In one of my Sunday school classes, I had a wonderful teacher, Daisy Larmer, and the church had camps. At camp, I was fortunate enough to have Daisy as a counselor, and she was the first person in my life, I'll get emotional, that I saw Jesus in. I told her, I said, whatever is in you, I want. And so she led me to the Lord on the bunk. I was probably 5th grade then. And I love her dearly to this day. I still see her.
Later, when you look back, you realize how much people prayed and were concerned to get youth into the church.
From playing baseball to having carnivals and camps,
sweethearts banquets, ski trips.
Every child, no matter how small, how rambunctious, how shy, was taken care of, was ministered to. It just reinforced the story of God's love.
Jake Beelig knew if you had a place that was attractive to children, their parents would bring them, and that gives you another opportunity to tell someone about the Lord. But also he knew that the future of the church was in children. Muzzy passed away in 1950, but other people caught the vision, and the Port of Call ministry just took off.
I got involved in it in 1958, and I was a hostess. Friday night, we would have an all-night prayer meeting. The Lord would handpick those that would come out.
I was stationed at Alameda in a patrol bomber squadron. I had a Christian background. I didn't buy it at the time. I'm young, I'll do that later. God was pulling at my heart.
I was on the Oriskany first and then on the Hancock, both carriers. And when I was at the Port of Call, just met a lot of really nice people, and the girls were nice too. And that's where I met my wife, Joyce.
Mixing games, and we'd have pantomimes. And then at the very end, gospel would be presented. And we would have many times 18, 22, 25 people that would go down to the prayer room.
Until I went in that prayer room, that's when the Holy Spirit met me. They would put all the beds out, and we'd just get in them. Then Montfona would come in, and she would sit down up by the fireplace, and she would read a scripture, and afterwards she would really say a nice prayer for everybody. Warm. It was peace. It was like you're home. Really thankful for what happened at the Port of Call.
It just was a family working together to further the gospel.
The continuum of the people changed. Muzzy,
Earl Sexauer, and Jake Beelig.
There was consistency of God's presence.
It was the Lord's work, not Earl's work.
Even though they grieved, they didn't all say, we're following a man, he's gone, we're going to go somewhere else. Really committed to the Lord. I think he was pleased. We're all sinners, but still I think he was pleased.
It was an atmosphere of expectation. You'd prayed for this particular church service. You had people around you that you knew didn't know the Lord. So it was an atmosphere of expectation. You were expecting to see God really move.
We saw servicemen giving their hearts weekly, daily to the Lord.
Night after night after night, there would be baptisms, there would be testimonies.
There was response. So what that does is strengthen your faith that indeed that serviceman next to you, he's going to get saved. It raises your faith and expectations of what you can expect from God. And so the faith was, next week, we're going to see even greater results.
In 1969, that was a big year for a kid of 14 years old, because that's when we landed a man on the moon, and we also opened Neighborhood Church here on the hill. We had basically outgrown the church in Oakland.
We're landlocked here. We want to reach more people, and that's going to take a leap of faith.
Where are we moving to? Castro Valley. Where's Castro Valley?
This used to be a quarry, and we had to get an agreement from all of these different property owners to even sell us the property to start with.
And so they started doing conceptual drawings and hanging them in the lobby at the church.
I remember Jake coming onto the platform one Sunday morning, and he had a shovel. And he said, we're going to be breaking ground in a month.
The church was here before the freeways were completed in this interchange. The board at the time knew that those things were going to happen, and this was a strategic location. It was the cathedral at the crossroads. We had to figure out how to move all the dirt off of this hill. The Oakland Coliseum needed a lot of fill. The dirt was moved for free from here down to the Oakland Coliseum.
Neighborhood Church is part of the Oakland Coliseum right now. That's our dirt.
When they were building the church, they were taking down some of the hill. And I remember telling my son, well, I'll never go to that church. What kind of church would ever take down a hill that God put up there? And here we are.
I believe it was on a Saturday when they were going to raise the crosses up, and I remember they were laying down out there, and I thought, man, these things are huge. It was just impressive to see a huge crane lifting those crosses up and setting them in place.
The 3 Crosses was such a rallying symbol for everyone in the church.
This was going to be our mission statement.
Never seen 3 crosses that tall and that white against the skyline. Happy that was your church and those were your crosses.
Everything was squeaky new. Sunday school classrooms. We had the backstage area, the orchestra pit, the baptismal, the huge fly gallery that only theaters had.
The first service here was thrilling. Everybody was happy and rejoicing.
Oh, it was exciting. You're aware that you're starting a new chapter.
They hit the ground running just like they had in the old church.
The new location in Castro Valley allowed us to do everything we had done before, but at a greater level. For example, the new portico, the 60-person dormitory, the gymnasium could reach so many more servicemen for Jesus Christ.
We moved here, we continued the illustrated sermons. Just being able to use the stage and the lighting and the sound was so far above what we'd ever had.
Oh, it was just amazing. And I had never, ever seen anything like that.
Our youth ministries just took on such a passion to reach students. One of the most innovative evangelistic events that I think our church has ever experienced is the kickoff rallies, which was a cheerleading competition.
They started in the Oakland church, and they had them downstairs in the basement.
They came to 3 Crosses in 1969. I mean, at the height of the kickoff rally, we had as many as 32 public schools, which would come up to this campus.
And it was actually a U.S. recognized cheerleader event.
The bricks was kind of the stage, and then you'd have over 2,000 students. We'd bring in a professional athlete, and they'd share their testimony, and we would see hundreds indicate that they had prayed to receive Christ.
This campus allowed for so many more souls to be reached for Jesus Christ.
There's a real uniqueness about this church in that it's had so few pastors, and when there are transitions, they're beautifully done.
Jake was an absolute evangelist. Larry continued and built on that foundation.
When I came to this church, I fell in love with Jake because he was such an evangelist, and the 2 things in my heart were teaching the Bible and learning how to share the gospel. So he remained, from even that transition, a real mentor to me about sharing Christ with people.
Of course, there was a dedication, and they prayed for Larry.
I felt so honored and privileged to step into that.
The transition between those two was just very easy.
There's no hard feelings. Nobody got pushed out the door. It's all under God's direction.
Was a really healthy church, but there was a real sense of what's next for us? What's the next mountain that we need to climb?
Each one of our senior pastors is built on the legacy of the other one. I wouldn't think they changed it at all. They just built on top of it.
We were entering a time where the culture was shifting and it was going another direction, and so all the more we needed that radical love. The port was still alive, but it was dwindling. And the base closures were imminent. By the time I became senior pastor, some of those bases were actually closing, and so we would show up on these bases and there'd just be a couple of people, and we'd have more workers than people that were on the base. It just became really evident that the Spirit of God was saying, this is a chapter that's closing. There's a harvest out there, but it's not here.
This church has always had a heart for theatrical production.
The illustrated sermons just began to dwindle, and it was obvious because people weren't coming. So when we started talking about the illustrated sermons going away, people kind of pushed back and like, well, wait a minute, this is the gospel. It's like, well, let's remember the gospel doesn't change, but the methods change. And this is a method that isn't connecting with our culture. We just decided to put all the eggs in the basket of these seasonal theatrical outreaches. And oh my goodness.
We branched into a whole new era. Cinderella, Music Man, 7 Brides and 7 Brothers.
Christmas, Easter,
God just began to grow that to the point today where every single program is completely full, sold out.
You can invite people to church at Christmas, but if you invite people to church to see Mary Poppins, you might get them in the seats a little before.
There's nothing better than to talk to a crowd of 1,500 people, knowing that God is preparing people out there to hear the message of His Son and His love for them.
Well, I guess I am the pastor who made the decision to actually can the kickoff rallies. Things changed in the culture. We had gangs starting to show up. Fights were erupting. Police were coming in. And at that point, I'm saying we might want to consider not do the kickoff rally any longer.
So my grandparents met at the Portical Ministry at the Oakland location. My grandma was a hostess, and my grandpa was a sailor. It's like a perfect love story. And so I grew up here, going to all the different youth events. I was involved in the youth ministries. I remember playing on those bricks out front, and I remember hearing about the kickoff rallies. Then we moved into this vision for what could go on those bricks, and it was the cafe. Someone threw out the idea of let's put in a coffee shop and let's do it well. I started at like the register, and now I'm the ministry director for it. It started off kind of humble beginnings, just a few hours in the mornings, and then it blew up. And so it's become now this space that, in the same way thousands of kids were being reached through kickoff rallies, we're seeing thousands of people every month that are coming up onto this hill, that are coming into the front door of the church, and they're experiencing the love of God, and they belong just over a cup of coffee.
There has been a seamless transition from pastor to pastor and ministry to ministry. There is no method of ministry that is sacred of itself. Our legacy is reaching lost people with the gospel.
This is just the same spirit as what God, was doing then, and we're just seeing that carrying on today. They understood the times in order to know what to do. That's what the Old Testament says. And there comes a point where ministry runs its course and you look for a new way to impact the community.
And the future is so bright because the history of our church has shown that God continues to show up and lead His people to make an impact in this community.
As it says in the New Testament, don't attach yourself to a man. I'm not a follower of Larry. I'm not a follower of Danny. I'm a follower of Jesus. And you follow Him, it'll be good.
Revelations 2:10, be faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life.
So now we're in a new chapter. Pastor Danny's got a message for this culture and this community. And I'm so excited to be behind him and the vision that God has for him.